Hello, everyone. My name is Linnea Anderson from the Archives and Special Collections Department. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the department, welcome to First Fridays Online. This season, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of First Fridays in Archives and Special Collections. I hope you are enjoying our program of presentations on anniversaries, beginnings, milestones, and memories throughout our collections. Today's presentations will also be posted later on the University of Minnesota Libraries YouTube channel, so you should be able to access them within the next few weeks. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former Library Director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections. And a special thank you to Alan and Jason from Middle English Interpreting, who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's presentations. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A function and not chat so that we can keep track of your questions. You can submit them at any time, but we will hold them until the end of the presentation as time allows. And we will now pause for a brief land acknowledgement. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for Native American students, faculty, staff, and community members. Our presentations today are Electronic Evolution, the Brave New World of Born Digital Archives at the University of Minnesota Libraries, presented by Lara Friedman-Shedlov, Digital Records Archivist in Archives and Special Collections, and Due Credit, Celebrating People Behind the Scenes at the Bell Library, presented by Maggie Ragnow, Curator of the James Ford Bell Library. And we will start with Lara, who will be speaking about digital records in Archives and Special Collections. We have been receiving archival collections in electronic formats for years, but it is only in the last 5 years that we have begun to systematically tackle the challenges of preserving and making these materials accessible. As of 2022, we have a full-time digital records archivist on staff. And during this presentation, you'll learn about some of the obstacles and opportunities that digital records present from the point of view of archives staff.
Hi, everyone. Just let me get my screen organized here. Good afternoon. Can you hear? Everything's good? I can be heard? All right. As Linnea said, I am Lara Friedman-Shedlov. I've been at the University of Minnesota Libraries for almost 20 years now, but I recently took on the role of Digital Records Archivist. I thought our First Fridays theme this year of recognizing anniversaries, beginnings, milestones, and memories would be a good opportunity to talk about our beginnings with working with archival collection material that is born digital and some of the milestones we've recently achieved. We are used to thinking of archives and special collections primarily as boxes of paper stored on shelves. We also deal, of course, with other formats like books and photographs, films, audio, videotapes, even artifacts. But we have primarily been concerned with preserving and providing access to these materials as physical objects. As professionals, we've gotten very good at bringing these things into the library, preserving them, and sharing them. But these days, the records and papers are increasingly coming to us not in boxes, but in bytes. That's bytes with a Y. Digital files aren't really a new thing, of course. Computers began to become common household items in the 1980s. The technology evolved quickly, as many of you may remember, 5.25-inch floppy disks giving way to the 3.5-inch ones, and then CDs, and then DVDs. and file formats were all over the place. Anyone else remember the days before the hegemony of Microsoft Word, when WordStar, WordPerfect, Xyride, and PerfectWriter battled it out in various offices? And that was just word processing on PCs. They all had their own file formats that couldn't be read by any of the other programs. But for a long time, that didn't really impact archives as much as you might think. One of the main reasons is that at first, most people were using computers primarily to replicate familiar analog formats. So although people might use word processing software to write something, the point was eventually to produce a printed document. And at first, when we received disks in archival collections, they often came along with printed copies of files. So we could kind of opt to just preserve the printed version and maybe worry less about the digital files. But now, increasingly, people are creating and using files in an entirely digital environment. Often, files are not even coming to us on physical media like disks and drives. They're coming to us from cloud storage. That's where people are doing and sharing their work these days. Perhaps more significantly, the very nature of the material that people are producing is evolving. We are no longer just using digital tools to replicate traditional analog formats. We are creating entirely new kinds of files that can't easily be just printed out or represented in analog form. Think, for example, of databases, or websites with links and maybe embedded videos, or social media, or digital art, or 3D architectural plans. Archivists have been aware of these challenges for decades, but for many years, it was possible to either just kind of avoid collecting digital materials or at least defer dealing with them. Now, just to clarify, these born digital materials, as that I'm referring to here, are different in many ways from digitized material. As you heard, if you tuned in to our First Friday's presentation 2 months ago, digitization is also something we are doing here in archives and special collections, and it presents its own set of challenges. These days, though, we have pretty efficient workflows and tools for creating digital copies of our analog materials. And here at the University of Minnesota, we have some great tools to make them accessible to the public too. For example, UMedia, which you can see a picture of here in the screen. And while some of the strategies, tools, and expertise we developed as we've expanded our digitization program are relevant when it comes to born digital files, there are a whole new set of concerns. So unlike with digitization, where we get to choose and control the file formats and other specifications, when it comes to born digital files, we have no control over how the files are created. The file formats might be obsolete and require software that is no longer available or that is prohibitively expensive for us to acquire. In some cases, the nature of the documents or the files themselves may require a specific computing environment to be emulated in order to experience them as intended. The media they are stored on may require specialized drives or other equipment. Sometimes people give us entire computers. Sometimes we have to figure out how to extract files from cloud-based systems that aren't really designed to export files in a way that can be used outside of those systems, or which aren't designed to easily export the number and size of files that we are trying to acquire from them. When we are dealing with files created by someone else, we also must be aware of the possibility of viruses and other malware. And apart from the more obvious issues related to format, there are additional challenges to working with digital files that are a bit different from or on a different scale from what we encounter when we work with our traditional analog material. The ease with which digital files can be created and iterated contributes to an often overwhelming number of files to deal with. So this screenshot here just shows the number of files in a fairly average collection. This one is 771 gigabytes, and it has almost 10,000 separate files, each of which, if printed out, could be who knows how many pages each. We have ways to search for and potentially delete exact duplicates, but there are often many similar and slightly but slightly different versions of files. Just as an example, many of us who remember the days when photography required developing film can probably remember that you might have shot a couple of rolls of film on a week's vacation, totaling maybe 50 or 60 photos. Now people routinely take 50 or 60 a day. Why not, right? There's nothing to stop you. People routinely take multiple shots just to get the perfect one because it's easy to do it. So it's not unusual for us to get huge amounts of photos, and many of them might be very similar to each other. Looking at files on a computer also does not really lend itself to quickly skimming through and grasping the general content. In some ways, it is a lot easier and more efficient to quickly leaf through a few folders of documents and kind of grasp what they're about. With digital files, each individual file has to be opened, which is more time-consuming. Now, there are some efforts underway to develop tools that can analyze content using things like natural language processing and other advanced techniques, but those are a long way from being at a stage where we can use them in our day-to-day work. So basically just trying to work with the files and understand what they're about can be really challenging. Another concern is that files tend to come to us sooner or younger than they did when they were on paper. In the past, it was often 10 or 20 years, if not much more, between the time a paper file was created and when it might end up in the archives. With digital files, they may, of necessity to ensure their preservation, come to the archives much sooner. It's not unusual for us to receive files that were created in the past year, and very common for them to have been created in the past 5 to 10 years. This means there is a lot greater likelihood that there is information in them that people may regard as sensitive or proprietary. And since digital files are much easier to replicate and share, the consequences of that data, especially data that is legally protected, are a lot more serious than if they were accidentally left in a box of paper files. So here are just some examples of the types of data that may be of concern. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but it has things like biometric identifiers, name, addresses, birth dates, email addresses, et cetera. And more critically, things like social security numbers or account numbers like credit card account numbers or bank account numbers. So in particular, we need to make sure that things like those social security numbers and credit card numbers are not present in files. Not only could sharing that data be harmful to the people whose data it is, but university data security policy actually prohibits us from even storing it on our file servers. But even apart from data like this that may be legally protected, as I mentioned before, the shareability and discoverability of digital files is at a scale that means people might just feel more protective about their files than they did about their paper files. And since they come to us younger, these files, they've been created more recently, sometimes they just discuss events or incidents that are recent enough to feel more sensitive to people or just be sort of proprietary, like they could have proprietary business information. So those are just some of the issues that kind of differentiate what the world that we're moving into now. Archivists really must get involved much earlier in the process of the creation of the material. We can't necessarily just wait passively for materials to come to us if we want to guarantee that they'll be usable and preservable. Increasingly, archivists are trying to have a say in the design even of the systems that are creating the files. For example, computer-aided design that's used in architecture. Although archives and archivists have never truly been neutral, traditionally, most archivists saw their role as one that avoided as much as possible any interference or influence over the nature or interpretation of the records themselves. So this getting involved early thing feels like a big change for most of us. And a traditional core tenet of archives is to preserve the original order of records, and as much as possible, any additional contextual information about their creator and the environment of their creation. But what does original order mean in the context of files that literally consist of bits of data that are stored in non-sequential order wherever space is available? Well, that's literally what's happening when files are stored on a disk. And when the files are accessed and read, the bits are aggregated and displayed to the user. So each time a file is read, it's changed. It can be copied an infinite number of times, and the copies cannot be discerned from each other. So the increasing prevalence of this born digital materials, kind of definitely changing our whole view of archives in some ways. It's just one of the many things that are changing for us in this field. So what are we doing about it here at the University of Minnesota? Well, starting about 10 years ago, it became clear that for archives and special collections, we can no longer put off developing a strategy, tools, and expertise to start managing this material. Important collections are increasingly being offered to us as digital files, and we wanted to be able to responsibly preserve and provide access to them alongside the material, the analog material we've always collected. So initial steps were taken actually starting in about 2012, when Arvid Nelson, who was at that time also the archivist for the Charles Babbage Institute, was asked to take on the role of what we called electronic records coordinator. So we had a need, which had been growing for already some time. We now had a person who had some time designated and responsibility for figuring stuff out. But this person had no special background in this area initially, and we didn't have any kind of budget for training or equipment to start out. So an ad hoc task force of staff from archives and special collections came together to work with Arvid, mostly folks who were among those who had the pressing questions about how to handle this material. We were being offered this material in our collections. So the big questions that we really wanted to address right away was, one, what kind of equipment would we use to transfer the files from whatever kind of storage media they arrived on? We were literally being offered, here's my hard drive, please take the files and then give me the hard drive back. So we needed to figure out how to do this. So whether it was something like that, or what if it's a floppy disk or a DVD, a thumb drive, or heaven forbid, a jazz drive. Once we get the files off, then how do we work with them? What tasks do we need to perform just at minimum to understand them and get them ready for researchers to use? And what kinds of tools or software do we need to do those tasks? And how do we ensure the files will be usable in the long term? Where do we store them? We're not talking about just gigabytes here, but terabytes worth of files. Where do we put them? And then how do we provide access to researchers? So the first thing we really needed to do was assess the situation and make a case for resources. We were able to get support for training, and this kind of blurry photo, apologies for that, is a picture of a bunch of manuals from some of the courses that we took. The Society of American Archivists, or SAA, which is the main national professional association for archivists in the United States, had begun offering a series of courses leading to a certification in digital archive called the Digital Archive Specialist Certification. So we were able to get support to host a number of those courses on site at the University of Minnesota so that a lot of Ask staff members could take them. A few staff members, including me, took additional classes both through SAA and other organizations so that we could take more of a lead role in this work. So we also put together specific requests for equipment that we knew we need. The most important thing was having a computer that was set up for this kind of work. We needed a workstation where we could keep files segregated from the network and quarantined until we had a chance to review them for malware and any kind of private or restricted data. And it would need a lot of storage to hold large collections of digital files while we worked on them. We also wanted to incorporate a device called a write blocker. It prevents accidentally changing files when we are copying them. In addition, we needed a collection of legacy disk drives and cords and things that would allow us to access the various types of storage media, which we would likely be encountering. In 2014, the ad hoc group that had come together to do this initial planning and strategizing was formally recognized and established as the Electronic Records Task Force. And we were then charged with developing the specs for this workstation, which we were able to purchase that year. So this is a bit of a dark picture, but that is our original workstation. And then jumping ahead in time a bit, within a few years, we were already outgrowing that original workstation. And with all the data that we gathered, that the task force gathered, we were able to successfully make a case for the purchase in 2018 of what's called a FRED. That stands for Forensic Recovery of Evidence device. And it's a specialized workstation developed by a company called Digital Intelligence. They were originally designed for and marketed to law enforcement and related industries that needed to recover and analyze data. The main reason we were interested in it was the storage capacity and the processing power and the many kinds of built-in ports and drives that we'd be able to put to good use in our work. And it also comes with a bunch of different cords and adapters and connectors and things that come in handy when working with all kinds of old disks and drives or computers that don't necessarily arrive at the archives with all the parts that they're supposed to have in order to work. And we still also have a bunch of external drives that we can connect for reading different kinds of legacy disks. So that's what you see in these photos. And this is the room. We have a special room where all of our stuff lives. So over on the left is where our FRED is set up. And then we also have a Macintosh computer for when we need to work with Macintosh files, our Apple and Macintosh files. And then we still have our original workstation and lots of places to store all these different disk drives and cords and things. So once we had any kind of workstation, though, we still needed to figure out what our process would be. So the biggest task that we had to do initially was figuring out kind of a basic workflow. So finding this workflow, identifying the software tools to accomplish each task, and then writing documentation. So members of the task force had taken lots of training in best practices, but we now had to decide what would make sense to do in real life. We had to figure out what materials to prioritize and how we could best apply what we learned to our specific situation. So this graphic here just kind of illustrates the basic steps that we distill it down. This is what we need to do minimally when we work with this material. We have to somehow figure out how to get it. So gathering information about it from whoever's donating it, and then literally getting it from them in some way. And then we have to gather information about it. So we would, these file manifests basically just means a list of all the files that come to us, and the metadata is the data about them, all the technical information that we can glean, like all the file formats, their sizes, and things like that. We need to find out if we need to scan it, look for any sensitive or private data and any virus or malware. Then we kind of need to understand it more at an intellectual level. What is it about? How is it organized? Decide what we need to do with it. If anything, do we need to make any changes to it in order for it to be preservable and usable? That could include changing file formats to things that we can preserve better or provide access to better, or getting rid of excessive numbers of duplicates, or it could be renaming files in some cases if the names are not useful. And then we assemble it into this AIP, that means archival information package. So that's like the final thing that we're going to preserve forever, is called an AIP. And then we need to store it somewhere. So that's overall what our process is. But of course, we need a whole bunch of tools to do that. So this is, each collection we work with is different and ends up having different needs. So this is just a snippet, which I don't expect you to be able to read, but it's just to give you a sense that we have lists of these tools. And although we've created lots of documentation, you can probably imagine that it is a challenge to be able to master all of these different tools and be able to use them when you need to, and to do so efficiently. So this is one of the reasons that led the task force to recommend that although working with Born Digital materials is something all of our staff need to understand to some degree and need the skills for, we also needed someone who could really specialize in it and be focused on this type of work. So more on that shortly. In the meantime, we recommended that instead of just a task force, a permanent electronic records management group be established. This group was chartered almost exactly 4 years ago now, in charge with making recommendations regarding policies, procedures, and technology updates to continue this work. And of course, the whole point of all this work is to be able to provide access to the material for researchers. In some ways, it may seem easier to provide access to digital files than to analog because they're digital, right? You can just put them online, and theoretically, people don't even have to physically travel to the archives to view them, right? Well, that is often possible for digitized material because we can decide exactly what format to put it in and control how it's created. But it's a lot more complicated when we're dealing with collections that might consist of 50 different kinds of file formats. Viewing any given file may require specific software to open and navigate it. Our ideal scenario would be if we could have a sort of online reading room that could run whatever software is required to view files. And there are archivists around the world who are actually working on building environments like this that could emulate, say, a 1993 Macintosh and allow you to view files with the software from that time, all via your web browser. But implementing something like that in real life is still a ways off. And even if we could provide seamless access online to all of our born digital archival collections, we still have tricky waters to navigate with things like copyright. Yeah, that old copyright thing keeps coming up. So in the meantime, we're making do with a number of possible approaches. So occasionally we can put things on UMedia or our Digital Conservancy, which is where some of our university archives records end up. But more often, we are able to provide access by putting things on Google Drive and then sharing it with people on a kind of case-by-case basis. We also can provide access on a special computer that we have in our reading room in the Wallen Center. And then in some cases, we even have a special computer, that's the one in this picture, that's set up with restricted access. So in cases where there are collections that have special restrictions on them, and we need to make sure, for example, that the material absolutely can't be copied in any way, and that we have more control over how it's being viewed. We have this special computer set up that we can literally wheel into our reading room, and people can use. So there's a variety of options depending on the situation that are available to us. So in 2019, our department chair, Chris Kiesling, began talking to me about taking on the role of digital records archivist with responsibility for coordinating work with born digital archival materials across the department. It wasn't possible for me to leave my previous role as description and access archivist in the Couts Family YMCA archives immediately. So initially, I was appointed for just 25% of my time with the intention of transitioning to full-time within a year. Now, the pandemic created some additional complications, so that timeline was extended. But as of 2021, it became the majority of my job. And this year, almost exactly 10 years after we took those first steps as a department to respond to these challenges, I officially became ASK's first full-time digital records archivist. And the first 3 months of this year, I've worked with floppy disks, CDs, DVDs, thumb drives, external hard drives, and files on Google Drive. File formats include not only your typical Microsoft Office files, but images, audio and video files, email, websites, social media feeds, even specialized software developed for specific organizations whose records we collect. I would say I've ingested or processed approximately 6 terabytes of data in the last 3 months. Also, I co-chair the Electronic Records Management Group, along with my colleagues, Carol Koosman, who is the library's digital preservation analyst, and Valerie Collins, who is the digital repositories and records archivist for the university archives. So what does the next 10 years look like? Who knows what curveballs technology is going to throw our way? We're constantly looking for and evaluating new tools that might help us do tasks we can't easily do right now, and looking for ways to streamline and maybe automate some of the more routine ones and automate some of those more routine ones. And while we've made a lot of progress and tackled a lot of terabytes, a lot of that was the low-hanging fruit, the files that were on media or in formats that were easier to deal with. So we're gradually starting to dig into some of the more challenging stuff. Some of the hardest things to deal with are not necessarily the biggest or the most numerous files, but the ones that are hardest to access or to understand. So it's looking like my job is pretty secure for a while. And I definitely could not do it without the support of my wonderful colleagues. So I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Go ahead and add them to the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end of today's event. And our next presenter is going to be Maggie Ragnow, speaking on due credit, celebrating people behind the scenes at the Bell Library. From before its inception, numerous people have worked behind the scenes to facilitate acquisition, access, and promotion of the materials in the James Ford Bell Library. So Curator Maggie Ragnow will share some of the stories of these unsung heroes and the significant contributions they've made. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lara. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Today, I'm going to be talking about a group that we probably don't talk about enough. The phrase, "it takes a village," has become perhaps an overused cliche. Nevertheless, in almost all arenas in life, the most celebrated accomplishments by an individual would not have been possible without a host of others working in the background. Today, rather than talk about the collection, which I usually do for First Fridays, I want to celebrate some of those people. When Ann Good and I, the Bell Assistant Curator, started thinking about this, we originally thought we would share the stories of some of the women behind James Ford Bell, the library's founder, and Jack Parker, the Bell Library's first curator, secretaries, catalogers, and so forth. However, as conversations around the university started focusing on student food insecurity and low student wages, which have greatly reduced the pool of students available or willing to work for the university, an institution that is largely run on student labor, it seemed to us that focusing this talk on the Bell student staff and student interns was a much better idea. Throughout this talk, I will refer to these students only by their first names. For some, I will show you photos we took when they were students. For others, I have some "Where Are They Now" photos that were readily available on social media. If a student chose a career in the library or museum field, I have specified their titles and their places of employment as they are my colleagues and posted the information online. For the rest, I note their current profession only when I have it. When I began as interim curator of the Bell Library in 2004, we had only one student staff member, Mike. However, I discovered that we had a student budget that was much larger. And we weren't using it. So from that point on, we hired anywhere from 4 to 11 students each year, plus took on student interns, both paid and volunteer. Until 2018, when we joined the rest of our colleagues in the Elmer L. Anderson Library building, we were on our own over in Wilson Library. We had our own suite of offices, reading room, kitchenette and workrooms, exhibit gallery, and the Bell Period Room. In addition to the Bell Library collection, we also were the service point for that part of special collections and rare books that remained in Wilson Library. Our students have filled a variety of roles over the years. Their primary job in our Wilson location was to monitor the reading room, greeting researchers as they came in, handling their initial requests, and answering the general phone line, all very customer service oriented. In order to maintain security in the reading room, it had to be under someone's watchful eye whenever a researcher was there using rare materials. We were open 40 hours a week, and almost all of our researchers were walk-ins, so we had to be ready to cover that entire period. Piecing together coverage from among the variety of student schedules is what resulted in the number of students we had working with us. Some worked 2 hours on Monday morning, 3 hours on Wednesday afternoons. Others could work all day on Thursday, but at no other time. You get the idea. That is a lot of students to keep busy if no researchers show up, so we put them to a variety of tasks and special projects. They made photocopies and digital scans of materials for researchers, for exhibitions, and for in-house publications. They entered collection use data into a database and created reports. They paged and reshelved materials in our adjacent vault, and they kept the place clean. Because we were a secure location, all custodial work had to be done during our regular open hours. But since we never knew when we'd have researchers, cleaning was only done sporadically by custodians. The rest of the time, it was done by staff and our student workers. For many, it wasn't their favorite part of the job, but for one student, Jordan, it was a mission. He had early morning hours, a time when we rarely had researchers, so he used that time to make the reading room spotless. He vacuumed the carpet and the cloth seats on the chairs. He dusted the reference books and the bookshelves in the reading room, and he cleaned the tables. And every few weeks, he did the windows. Yes, windows. Our reading room had banks of windows on both of two sides, which regularly needed cleaning, and Jordan embraced the challenge. I don't think the place was as spotless or as sparkly as when he was working there. One of my earliest experiences with students as curator was with Chris. In spring of 2005, only a few months after I started as interim curator, Chris walked into the reading room. Not the Chris you see here. Leather jacket, wild hair, multiple and extravagant piercings. He asked to see something cool. Well, I was alone in the reading room, so I couldn't get anything out of the vault, so I took him into the exhibit gallery and started pointing out items in the exhibition, which happened to be Shakespeare and the World. He listened attentively and asked good questions. I still wasn't sure if he wasn't having me on, but I told him that the next time he stopped by, I'd show him some cool maps. I didn't think I'd see him again, but a month or so later, he was back, reminding me of my promise to show him some maps. He was a freshman by this time, and on his next visit, yes, there were multiple visits, he said that he might be interested in volunteering at the Bell if there was something interesting for him to do. He did a volunteer internship for a while and then a semester paid internship. His project was to try to figure out places on an unlabeled map of islands in one of our books. Through his research, he discovered that the map had been printed backwards and that it was a map of islands in the Greek archipelago, inexpertly drawn and located. He assigned most of them their 21st century identities, teaching me how to use Google Maps, then in its infancy, along the way. During his time at the Bell, Chris never stopped asking questions about graduate school, about scholarship, about geography. He became fascinated with the Silk Road, the overland route from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean to China. He was accepted into an undergraduate program at the American University in Cairo for a semester. And when it was over, he decided to travel the Silk Road himself, overland from Cairo to China. He traveled with a variety of people he met along the way, fellow students, others, staying in hostels and sleeping rough because he had virtually no money, just a plane ticket home from Hong Kong. He made it, half-starved, an already skinny kid. He'd lost more than 20 additional pounds. These are some of the photos he sent me of his adventures. The photo in the middle is his family, whom he brought to the Bell when his grandmother was visiting from Bogota, Colombia. He also brought me back this hat. It's a traditional Kazakhstan hat called a kalpak. I keep it in my office where it reminds me of him whenever I look at it. I have a lot of souvenirs like that from a variety of students. It's been a few years since I've heard from him, but the last time I did, he was doing something in intelligence for one of the government's alphabet agencies. I think it was the CIA, but I'm not 100% sure. Christine was awarded a paid undergraduate internship through the Bell Foundation. She spent the summer of 2006 researching our 1507 Waldseemüller Globe Gores map. It would be 500 years old in 2007, and we were planning a big exhibition. Not only did she do a great job researching in the Bell collection, finding articles online and other resources, but near the end of the summer, she had an opportunity to take a week-long vacation visiting friends in Washington, D.C. And what did she do with her spare time? She went to the Library of Congress, which holds Waldseemüller's 9-panel wall map a companion piece to our small globe gores, and researched it and everything they had on it. She sent me scans and photos and brought back several photocopied articles as well. Through my early experiences with Chris and Christine, I learned just how inspiring the Bell collection can be. Christine graduated with a degree in anthropology, worked for a while in a museum, and then came back to the U to get her pharmacy degree. In the following year, 2007, Mandy not only created an online exhibition about Waldseemüller and his map, but she helped with creative aspects of our gallery exhibition as well. Pictured here is a movable astronomical instrument that added an interactive element to the exhibit. This is a reproduction of a similar working paper instrument sewn into one of our books. It's called a vovelle, created by the 16th century mathematician Peter Apian. To make this, Mandy took dozens of photographs of the vovelle, moving the pieces each time so that she could get a complete picture of each movable part. She then photoshopped the images, scaled them to size, printed them, cut them out, and glued them to poster board. The bottom poster board piece is mounted on styrofoam. She then fixed them together in the center so that each piece can move independently, just like they could in the actual book. Total rock star. My slides aren't moving. There we go. Perhaps the largest project the Bell Library has ever had also required the most student hours. In 2011, we were awarded a grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities to find, document, and scan all of the maps in our more than 11,000 books. This entailed paging through each book to find the maps, bookmarking them, assigning IDs to each map so they could be scanned and put together in batches for scanning, collecting metadata to document each map once it was scanned and uploaded into the library's digital repository, UMedia, and of course, keeping track of all of it. Jason initially visited the Bell to conduct dissertation research, but when he realized that he wasn't sure if he wanted to complete his PhD, he came back as an intern. We had just received the Ricci map at that time, a 6-panel, 5-foot tall by 12-foot long map of the world in Chinese. Perhaps you've heard of it. So I asked him to create a working research guide for us of Bell materials related to China broadly and to the Jesuits in China more specifically, since Matteo Ricci was a Jesuit missionary. When we received the NEH grant for the MAPS project, we were able to offer him a paid internship to help create the systems to manage the project, collect metadata, and train students. Here he is pictured working on the project with undergraduate intern Laurel. The other photo shows Matt, a graduate student in library science from Canada, who chose to do his required internship at the Bell, also working on the MAP project. He's collecting the higher level metadata needed to upload the maps into UMedia. Here are a few of the other undergraduate students who worked on the NEH project during their time at the Bell. Alex had the distinction of discovering the 15,000th map in the collection during the second year of the project. Sorry, my mouse isn't moving. There we go. And now I'd like you to meet Radu. Radu joined us his freshman year, before he really had a sense of who he was or what his potential could be. He was, however, a business major, so we introduced him to our database, and he was home. Radu became king of the database, our data guru. He found ways to improve the structure of the database, improved methods for generating reports, created reports that were accurate and detailed, and trained his fellow students on his operation. He helped us redesign our researcher registration forms so that they meshed better with the database, and contributed to the redesign of our paging slips as well. As his expertise grew, as well as his responsibilities at the Bell, Radu became more self-confident. I'll never forget the day Radu showed up in a formal suit instead of his usual t-shirt, shorts, and tennies. He was making a presentation in his marketing class, and he was looking sharp. You see him here as a medieval crusader in costume at our 60th anniversary gala in 2013. Radu's job was to keep food and drink out of the bell room where the 17th century Ricci map was on display. So he chose this knight's costume and a very serious demeanor to execute his task. Although Radu was shy and quiet, we learned over the years that he had a dry and wicked sense of humor. Also on this slide are students Katie and Raya, also in special dress for the 60th anniversary event. Their bubbly personalities made them the perfect greeters for this evening. For their regular bell hours, they also worked as data collectors for the NEH grant project, as well as monitoring the reading room and paging and shelving materials. Lily was an undergraduate history major who was fluent in French. When she came looking for an internship, I thought I'd start her on processing the archive of Sir Thomas Bendish, who was the English ambassador to the Ottoman court in Constantinople from 1647 to 1661. It seemed like a very good place to start because it was English, but because these are 17th century materials, not only does one have to handle the language, but you have to handle the handwriting as well. So we usually try to start students out on processing projects in English. About a week into the project, I'm working in my office, which is adjacent to the reading room, and I hear this whoop coming from the reading room. I dash in to see what's wrong, and Lily is looking pale, but so excited she can barely speak. She's standing next to the table that she was working on, the one you see here, and pointing to a document. Breathlessly, she tells me that it's the chit that Bendish was required to present to the guard at the Tower of London when he was committed there for supporting King Charles I during the English Civil War. Apparently, he'd kept it and added it to his papers, which are now in the Bell Library. It was a thrilling moment for a student intern, as well as a pretty thrilling moment for this curator. When Lisa completed the Bendish project, I was able to obtain some funding for a paid internship to process and create a finding aid for a new acquisition, the family and business papers of a Western French merchant family doing business on the island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti in the Caribbean. The documents were in French, and Lisa did a brilliant job organizing the material and creating an item-level inventory, which tells the researcher what each individual document is about. Her experience with the Bendish archive, however, made the strongest impression on her. She wrote a paper on Bendish for the history department, and it also informed her master's thesis at another institution. She graduated from the U with BAs in French, history, and operatic performance. As a professor and historian, her primary research interest today is on trade, travel, and piracy in the Mediterranean in the age of Sir Thomas Bendish. While some of our student staff enjoy their time in the Bell but continue on a previously chosen career path, several have decided instead to pursue work in libraries and museums, like Molly and Sarah. Zoe first visited the Bell Library as a research assistant to one of our history department faculty. She returned as a member of our student staff. Among the usual responsibilities, Zoe also helped us judge the topical prize sponsored by the Associates of the James Ford Bell Library for Minnesota History Day. And before moving out east to get her master's in library science, she served on the Associates board for a year. Eric was born on the island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. He joined the Bell Library staff as a student while pursuing his BA. He also was fluent in French and wanted to learn more about the history of the Caribbean, so we put him to work creating a research guide to Caribbean materials in the Bell collection. I think we probably learned as much about Caribbean culture as Eric did about Caribbean history. The Bell Library has benefited from dozens of students over the years, undergraduate and graduate students, undergraduate and graduate interns, and even some postgraduate interns. Here are a few more. Jonathan worked at the Bell during graduate school. Research he conducted on one of our documents while working in the Bell was later published as one of our James Ford Bell essays. In addition to teaching history and humanities, he just happens to be married to Anne Good, the Bell's assistant curator. Emily led her creative talents to exhibit design. Matt was trained by Radu on the database. and Rachel created her own exhibition on Queen Elizabeth I of England and the adventurous men with whom she surrounded herself. It was on display in Anderson Library. Marcus was a graduate student working in the Bell in the late 1990s, when the current sprinkler system was installed in the Wilson Vault. So perhaps it was more his brawn than his brains that were put to use by curator Carol Ernest at the time. With such a large cohort of students and interns in any one year, we always made it a point to gather them together a few times a year when we could. We had a group training session in the fall. They attended our December open house, an all-day cookie fest. And most years we had a celebratory gathering at the end of spring semester. Here's the gang in Uptown in 2013. Things are a bit different today. We moved into Anderson Library in 2018, where student hiring and management are centralized. The Bell usually gets 1 or 2 students, sometimes 3 a year. They take their turns monitoring the central reading room along with all of the other department student staff. During their Bell-specific hours, they do page and reshelve books, but they primarily work on a variety of special projects. They still enter data into our database, make scans for patrons, and work on exhibitions. One student, Mimi, continued to work on digital projects throughout the pandemic. We also still have 2 or 3 student interns a year, also working on a variety of projects. Cody is new to the Bell this year. He's working on a database project and helps set up carts for scheduled classes. He wanted his photo in this presentation to represent his awe of the cool materials in the collection. Maya is finishing up her time in the Bell. She'll soon graduate with a degree in engineering. She wants to manage her large-scale construction projects like bridges and dams. In these photos, she's working on a microfilm project, reorganizing it, ensuring that everything is properly labeled so an up-to-date inventory can be made. She's one of the most organized students we've ever had in the Bell, and anytime something looks a little bit disorganized, Maya's right there making it more useful. Maya's also conducting research for our summer exhibition on textiles and costumes. This has been a wonderful trip down memory lane for me. I hope you've enjoyed it. Time has only allowed me to share a few of our terrific students with you today. I hope, however, that I've conveyed a sense of how important our student staff and interns are to the Bell Library, to the university libraries, and to the university as a whole. They are integral to the work that we do and to the services we provide our researchers. Working in the library is part of their educational experience as well as a source of income, however modest. And as you can see, it helped to prepare many of them for wonderful and interesting careers. Getting to know them is one of the highlights of ours. Thank you.
Thank you to our presenters. We have a few minutes left and time for a couple of questions. And it looks as though the first 2 questions are for Lara regarding electronic records. And if any of the rest of you in the audience have a question, please just put it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So the first question is, what type of virus scan software does the University of Minnesota use?
Hi. Well, fortunately, that isn't something that, as it turns out, because we are part of a large, very technology-aware organization like the University of Minnesota, we have an IT department that is very on top of this issue. So we have a university-wide virus protection software installed. I believe it's Windows Defender. And I know that they implement virus detection at both on individual workstations and also on our servers. So there's kind of a double layer of protection. So as it turned out, when we looked into this, it wasn't something that we needed to apply our own separate virus scanning software to it because it's already kind of taken care of by the university. But for a lot of people working in this area, a lot of digital archivists, it is definitely something that they need to look into. And there are some free and open source virus detection softwares out there. One of them is called Clam AV that's often used. So, but we're in pretty good shape with that.
And our second question is also for Lara. Where is all this information coming from? Personal donation, groups, etc.?
Yeah, all of the above, the same kinds of places that all of the donated material that we've always collected has come from. The same people that were sending us boxes of paper files in the past are sending us files on various disk drives and things nowadays. So it could be authors, artists, organizations that we're interested in, and you name it, every person or organization that we've ever collected materials from potentially could be sending us digital files now.
And we have another question now on electronic records. Someone would like to know, what is the ideal format for data submissions?
Well, I don't know that there's any single, there isn't any single ideal format, because it really depends on what kind of information is being sent. There are standards that have been set by organizations like the Library of Congress, for example, where they have lists of preferred formats that are right now the ones that are the easiest to preserve long term. They would be too numerous for me to list off and kind of probably too boring, but there are definitely like preferred formats for anything that is like a textual based document, or anything that's an image, or anything that's a sound file, for example. So if that is definitely, if you're somebody who's looking to work with us on donating some materials, that would be something we would talk with you about, and we could share more information about what we know. And if there's an option to choose those file formats, we definitely do have preferences, but there are just so many different kinds of file formats out there. I couldn't just give you one.
And I will wait just a few seconds here in case another audience member is sending in another question. We have time maybe for one more. All right, I'm not seeing any pop up, but thank you for all of the terrific questions, everyone, and thanks to our presenters. And we would like to invite you to join us again on May 6th online for Minnesota Landscapes, Documenting Environmental History Through Archival Sources, presented by Caitlin Morkin, Project Archivist in the University of Minnesota Archives. And How Did We Get Here? Moving the History of Computing to the University of Minnesota, presented by Amanda Wick, Curator of the Charles Babbage Institute Archives. And a reminder that you can see today's presentations on the University of Minnesota Libraries YouTube channel in a few weeks. Thanks for attending, everyone.